This is a simple mathematical model to illustrate counter-cyclical policy. First, we start with R. R denotes the interest rate, and interest rate is controlled or managed by the central bank or the Federal Reserve. Next, we look at supply equals to demand based on the national income accounting identity. Y is GDP, that is the goods and services being produced. We take it to be the supply of goods and services. Right hand side has three items, the sum of C, I, and G. They are the demand components of the aggregate demand. So C is private consumption, I is investment demand demanded by the firms in investing in machinery. G is government spending. It is a demand for goods and services by the government. Consumption is C. Private consumption, so-called, is positively related to disposable income. Disposable income is denoted by Y minus T, where T is tax. Okay, GDP, income, less tax. This is disposable income. As disposable income increases, private consumption would go up too. Now, we look at I. I stands for private investment. Private investment is positively related to national income or GDP. As GDP goes up, private investment would increase. How about the relation between investment and interest rate? It is a negative relationship. As interest rate goes up, as interest rate is the cost of investment, investment demand would decrease. So there's a negative sign there. Okay? Substituting the expression for private consumption and also private investment into the demand equals to supply equation, we would have Y equals to C plus I plus G eventually, after some rearrangement and substitution, an expression for GDPY as a function of G, T, and R. Now, we want to interpret the expression for GDP in the short run in terms of counter-cyclical policy. As G increases, GDP would go up. If G decreases, GDP will go down. Hence, changing G will be able to change Y in the short run. Likewise, a decrease in T or an increase in T will bring about a change in Y. How about monetary policy? By reducing interest rate, GDP would increase. By increasing interest rate, GDP would decrease. Therefore, a change in G, T, or R will bring about changes in GDP in the short run. And we have illustrated using this simple mathematical model how counter-cyclical policy may be used to change GDP in the short run. Next, let us look at the multiplier effect of fiscal expansion, represented by an increase in government spending G. When G increases by $1, GDPY increases by more than $1. What's the reason? Look at this simple explanation from the national income identity. Y equals to C plus I plus G. When G increases, obviously GDPY would increase. When GDPY increases, it will lead to an increase in consumption C. Consumption increases because disposable income has gone up. Likewise, investment would increase because investment is positively related to GDP. Both an increase in C and an increase in I will lead to an increase in GDP. Now we go on to the cycle. A very nice cycle. As GDP increases, C and I would increase. As C and I increases, GDP will increase. As GDP increases, C and I will increase. Hence, we have this multiplier effect. When we differentiate the expression for GDP with respect to government spending, we would have an answer, a number, which is greater than 1. Going to the labor market diagram, the demand curve, the demand for labor would shift to the right. Next, we will illustrate or explain briefly the multiplier effect of fiscal expansion through a decrease in tax, denoted by T. When T decreases by $1, GDP would increase by more than $1. What is the reason? As tax decreases, disposable income will go up. As private consumption is a function of disposable income, private consumption would go up. As private consumption goes up, based on the national income identity, as consumption demand goes up or private consumption goes up, GDP would increase. What happens when GDP increases? When GDP increases, it will lead to an increase in private consumption as well as an increase in private investment. Both increases in consumption and investment will lead to increase in GDP. Now look at the cycle. As GDP increases, it will lead to increase in consumption and investment. As consumption and investment increases, they will lead to an increase in GDP. As GDP increases, consumption and investment will increase. Hence, we keep on going through this cycle, which is a multiplier effect. Going to the expression for GDP and differentiate GDP with respect to T, we would have a number which is greater than 1 in absolute value. Why there's a minus sign? It means when tax goes up, GDP will go down. Negative relationship. When tax goes down, GDP would go up, and the absolute value is greater than 1. Therefore, a multiplier effect. Translating this to the labor market diagram, the demand curve or the demand for labor would shift to the right. Remember, we say that an increase in G or decrease in T will be translated to an increase in GDP. And in the labor market, they are translated as counter-cyclical fiscal policy and shift the demand curve in the labor market to the right-hand side as illustrated over here. So this diagram, let me explain a little bit. The vertical axis refers to the wage rate of the workers. The horizontal axis refers to the quantity of labor or employment. First, look at the downward sloping demand curve. That is the labor demand curve pre-recession. How about the labor supply curve? Pre-recession employment is maximum. Therefore, any further increase in wage would not induce more employment. Instead, the employment stays constant at the maximum. Hence, this segment of the labor supply curve is vertical. How about the horizontal segment? Why is it horizontal? The basic assumption is that wages are rigid in the short run, perhaps due to contract signed between the employers and the employees. Hence, wages are fixed, and therefore we have a horizontal segment of the labor supply curve. Now, consider the negative impact of the Great Recession, or we can consider the impact of the pandemic. The demand for labor curve will shift to the left because the demand for labor has gone down, has decreased. So it is illustrated by a level shift of the labor demand curve. The labor demand curve cutting the horizontal segment of the labor supply curve bring about a drastic drop in employment, and that it is related to a high level of unemployment or recession. The government will respond by having counter-cyclical policy. Expansionary fiscal policy, such as an increase in G or decrease in T, or expansionary monetary policy, such as a decrease in interest rate R. What would be the effect? That would lead to a rightward shift in the labor demand curve, bringing about a partial recovery. The labor demand curve cuts the horizontal segment of the labor supply curve, giving an employment level higher than the original, much lower employment due to the deep recession, but it is before or less than the pre-recession employment. Therefore, there is partial recovery. It will take much time, a little bit more time, for the economy to recover back to the pre-recession employment. How about the pandemic? Likewise, currently, we observe a partial recovery. It takes some time for the economy and society to recover fully. We just need some patience. That concludes our simple video explanation. We have used a simple mathematical model to illustrate counter-cyclical policy able to change GDP in the short run. And we translate that into the labor demand and labor supply framework. A shock such as the global financial crisis will shift the labor demand curve to the left, same as the impact of the pandemic. Counter-cyclical policy will shift the labor demand curve to the right slightly, bringing about partial recovery. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.